What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we're going to check out the macro that I've created for Windwalker monks starting out in the War Within. Before we do though, let's go ahead and open up the talent tree and we can see what I've got going on here. Now, Windwalker Monk currently is one of my favorite specs to play in WoW. I love this talent tree. I think it's such a big improvement over what was in Dragonflight. Even though it still plays the same way, there's a lot more that has been done to simplify and reduce the ability bloat that existed before. So, with that being said, this build is initially taken from a Wowhead Mythic Plus build. I like to go for Mythic Plus builds because they're more usable in multiple scenarios, like whether you're doing outdoor content, maybe fighting a few enemies at once, or dungeons, like even simple dungeons. A build like this can still be useful fighting multiple enemies. So that's why I've chosen a build like this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I've got going on here. There are a few deviations I've made to simplify things a little bit further, but for the most part it's a pretty straightforward build. I always like to say that it's a straightforward build. I don't know why, but anyway, yeah, so on this side, you know, there's a lot of utility. You know, there's a few things that just buff abilities. There's nothing really on this side that's going to affect the sequence at all, really, but the one thing that I will point out is me choosing Chi Wave over Chi Burst. I want to experiment with this one a little bit more as time goes on, but for now I've chosen to go with Chi Wave because it's a straight up passive. You don't have to worry about it, you don't have to use it, whereas Chi Burst is a proc ability, which means that when it procs, that's when you can use it, and that would be an extra ability that I would have to put into the macro, which is fine. I can do that, but if I can opt not to do that in favor of something else, even if it's a little bit less effective, less desirable, then I'm going to go that way just for the simplicity of the macro. It's a proc ability, like both of them proc. It's just that, you know, Chi Wave or Chi Burst automatically procs. That's my understanding of how these two abilities work. So that's why, you know, I've chosen not to go with it. Okay, so that's something that you would want to consider if you do want to take Chi Burst over Chi Wave. Then that's something that would either need to be added into the macro or managed on a separate button. So, speaking of passives, we go over here on the right side, and the first thing we get to do is we get to make Expel Harm a passive, which is nice because we get to still benefit from Expel Harm, but now we don't have to actually cast it. It's basically removed from the rotation and made into a passive. I like when this happens, and you know what? The cool thing is there's a lot of these. There's a few of these throughout our rotation. If we were to say go with Jade Fire Stomp, then we can essentially turn that into a passive, or we can choose to go for Jade Fire Stomp as an ability. Now, I haven't gone with it either way, but I still think it's cool that that's an option. And there are a few of these in here. There are a few passive benefits that we can have. Oh, Rushing Jade Wind, that's another one. So, yeah, so this turns Rushing Jade Wind, we can have it, but it makes it a passive. So we don't actually have to cast Rushing Jade Wind, which is pretty cool. So yeah, so all that's done to kind of consolidate how many abilities we have to press, which is exactly what we try to do with Gnome Sequencer. So the fact that Blizzard allows us to do that through the talent tree, I feel is pretty cool. There's still plenty added though, obviously. I mean, you've got your core stuff like, you know, Rising Sun Kick and Fists of Fury, you know, you've got that going on. You know, you've got like obviously your core rotation, and then we have added in Strike of the Wind Lord here. I always have a hard time finding stuff. And of course, you know, we're going to take Storm, Earth, and Fire and invoke Zuyin. That's obviously in there as well. And then of course, Whirling Dragon Punch is the way we've gone down here, and then taking just these passives here. So these are just kind of standard passives, stuff like that. So that's pretty much it. Obviously, we have gone with a Dance of Chi-Ji. It's pretty powerful, both in single target and in AoE, so that's just a good one to go with either way. And we'll talk about this once we get into the macro. There's a reason why this is a 3-button system I've got going on here. Okay, so with all that being said, let's go ahead and check out our macro. This macro is called WINDWALKER, and it's an all-in-one macro that we've got going on here. And I really like this macro. I'm mostly happy with how it performs. You know, we're doing our standard priority loop with shorter cooldown abilities on the inside and longer cooldown abilities on the outside. This is the class that made me appreciate the reverse priority pattern that we can use in here. And this is going to loop twice. So the reason why I like reverse priority with this one is because of Tiger Palm. Okay, so Tiger Palm is our it's our ability that doesn't use a cooldown. It uses our energy and we use it to build up chi. So this is how we generate chi. Now, the challenge traditionally with Tiger Palm has always been trying to fit it in the macro in a way where we're using it enough to generate chi, but not too much that we're not doing anything else. The way I've managed to achieve this is by putting it at the top of a reverse priority. And the reason why is because it's going to get used a lot. The macro is going to try to use it, but before it does, it's going to jump down to the next ability on the list and then slowly come back up to it. That way, we're making sure that we're still getting a lot of opportunity to use Tiger Palm and generate chi, but we're also making sure that we're moving to new abilities, trying to spend that chi as much as possible before we generate more. And this seems to work incredibly well for WINDWALKER Monk. I'm testing it with a lot of different classes. If you've checked out my other macros, I'm using reverse priority a lot, but I have found it especially good for WINDWALKER monks, and I rarely, does happen, but I do rarely find myself overcapping chi. It's not that it's never going to happen, it certainly will happen, especially when we activate Storm, Earth, and Fire, which is an off global cooldown ability, which is why I've been able to include it in here with Tiger Palm. The macro is going to use it as every time it hits Tiger Palm, which is going to be a lot, it's going to also activate Storm, Earth, and Fire if it's off cooldown. So it'll use one charge, then it'll use the second charge, and then it will wait until it becomes available again. This also means that it's going to cause your dudes to attack whatever you're attacking because it's going to keep hitting it. So that's something as well. But it's just going to keep it in your in your macro, and you don't really ever have to worry about pressing it. So that's something that, always remember that you can edit these. If you don't like how something works, you're welcome to remove it. So of course we also have start attack in here to make sure that our fists are always flying. With that, we can move on to the next ability. So next up in the priority is Whirling Dragon Punch. This is not a proc, but it has a specific, kind of a unique type of requirement where we need to have Fists of Fury and Rising Sun Kick on cooldown before we can use Whirling Dragon Punch, which also has a cooldown. In my case, it's like just under 20 seconds. So I put this high up in the priority so that way we make sure that we are trying to use it, even though we're going to skip over it a lot because it's not going to be available. It's either on cooldown or the other abilities need to be used first. But still, putting it up high in the priority means that we'll have more chances to actually use it, and that way it's not getting wasted before those abilities come off cooldown. So that's kind of my logic there. And then, of course, we do have Rising Sun Kick and Fists of Fury next in the priority, trying to use those, spending our chi on them as much as possible and keeping them on cooldown, which, by the way, the reason why I have no channeling in every single block here with all of these abilities is to make sure that we are not accidentally interrupting Fists of Fury. So that's why that is there. And of course, after that, last up, we have Blackout Kick. This is what's really cool about what seems to be about this macro so far with this reverse priority, is that we are still using Blackout Kick. Not super often because it's at the bottom of the priority, but we're still using it in the rotation without spending all of our chi. This has always been the problem with WINDWALKER monks with me trying to macro it, is trying to balance building chi with Tiger Palm and not doing too many Tiger Palms, but also not spending all of our energy and all of our chi on Blackout Kick. So putting it at the bottom of this priority means that it's still going to get used, but not nearly as much as everything else. So it gives it a smaller chance that the macro will actually activate the ability. I would say it's arguably too small, And that's why this is a 3-button system, because what I would suggest if you're using this macro, you're spamming away at it, is that you have blackout kick and spinning crane kick. We haven't talked about that one yet. Have those on separate buttons. The reason why is because both of them have a proc. Blackout kick has blackout kick with an exclamation point as the proc, which basically gives you a free blackout kick. And then spinning crane kick has dance of Chi G as a proc, which you can also use when you get that proc. So having those abilities on separate buttons is a good idea because for 2 reasons. One, you can use blackout kick when you get that proc, or spinning crane kick as well, and the macro will sometimes also occasionally cast blackout kick. And so that allows you to have a little bit more control over, your procs, making sure that you're using those when they become available and getting the most out of them. And also, if say you're overcapping chi or you're getting too close to it, you can use an extra blackout kick in there, or spinning crane kick if you're fighting in AoE situations, to make sure that you're not overcapping your chi, and then mostly focus on spamming away at this macro here, only jumping over to those when the situation calls for it. So you're going to have to keep track of your procs. I use some weak auras for it, and of course keep track of your chi as well, and you can use those other abilities as the situation calls for them, and otherwise the macro is still going to pretty much take care of everything else. So that's how this loop is going to work. A little bit of a caveat with you having to still use a couple of extra abilities outside, but that's, like I said, mainly for the procs. Otherwise, this is what the macro is going to prioritize, these shorter cooldown abilities. It's going to throw out a lot of tiger palms, but it should also give a pretty significant chance to spend that chi before you overcap it. Though you have to remember, these macros are never going to be perfect. They're never going to execute as well as a skilled player executing their rotation. So there will be times that you might overcap your chi. There may be times where you don't have enough chi and you're having to build it back up real quick. So you're going to have those situations where these macros just are not going to be perfect. But these are the abilities that are in the core priority loop. The macro is going to spend most of its time trying to use them. But once it goes through this loop twice in the reverse priority pattern, it's going to hop out of the loop and then try to use these abilities that are on the outside. And they would be Strike of the Wind Lord, which has a 30-second cooldown that just hits the threshold for abilities that I like to keep out of the priority loop. And then, of course, we have Invoke Zuyen, the White Tiger, and, of course, Touch of Death. So I just realized I need to put no channeling on these, which I will do. Don't worry about it. I will put no channeling on these 2 abilities so they don't interrupt your Fists of Fury on accident. But either way, the idea here is that these abilities are on the outside because they have longer cooldowns. I tend to put abilities that have 30 seconds or longer out of the main priority loop. That way, these longer abilities that aren't going to need to be used as often aren't bogging down your macro. Your macro will spend more time trying to use abilities with shorter cooldowns and then jumping out occasionally to try to use these, which the drawback to that means that they might not always go off as soon as they become available. It might take a little bit longer, maybe a couple cycles, but again, that's kind of a caveat that kind of comes with using a system like this. For me, it's a better trade-off than like having your macro spend constantly trying to use these abilities when they're spending so much time on cooldown, which is pretty much how these work. So that's why they're on the outside, and that they tend to go off pretty consistently, pretty quickly for the most part. Occasionally it might take a little bit longer than I would like, but either way, the macro is still taking care of these abilities. Even with Strike of the Windlord's chi requirement, it's still being used. Invoke Zuyen kind of behaves like a cooldown ability, but unfortunately, it does activate the global cooldown, unlike Storm, Earth, and Fire, so that's why it has to have a block of its own. It's kind of like Bestial Wrath, and how some of these like abilities that sort of behave like cooldowns activate the global cooldown. I guess you are summoning a white tiger, so maybe it just kind of considers it more of an ability because you actually are physically summoning something on the screen, so that would make sense, but still it is something that I guess needs explanation. So Basically, what's going to happen here, your macro is going to spend most of its time trying to get through your core rotation, building and spending chi the best that it can, doing a fairly decent job, and then hopping out to use your longer cooldown abilities occasionally. Remember that you're going to want to keep Blackout Kick and Spinning Crane Kick on separate buttons to make sure that you are using up your procs and perhaps occasionally controlling your chi and not overcapping it if it looks like that's something that might happen. So yes, your mileage may vary, but either way, I feel like this has been working out pretty well. Windwalker Monk is a lot of fun to play, so if you want to check out this macro, feel free to import it into your game through Gnome Sequencer, and don't forget to hotkey it as always, and if you use it, please let me know what you think about it down in the comments below. And with all of that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.